Hey y'all. So today we are doing two things. We have two goals. One, we want to compare and contrast our two types of cells. The first kind of cell is prokaryotes, the second kind of cell is eukaryotes. The second goal of today is to compare these cells to viruses. So let's start off with a recap of the cell theory. So it says here that all cells must follow what we call the cell theory, and they must have the characteristics of life, which we use this acronym OGRACES. This is a cell theory that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. If you're living, you have to have a cell in you. That's just foundational. If you do not have a cell in you, then you are not considered a living thing. The next thing is the cell is the basic unit of structure and organization. So basically, it's the basic unit of life. Again, if you're living, you have to have at least one cell. And the third part of cell theory is that all cells come from pre existing cells. So you can't just spontaneously create something that's living, it must be produced from something that already has at least one cell. Now, there's two other things I want to add to this. So, the fourth thing is that cells carry genetic material that gets passed down from one cell to the next. So, if I'm doing basically the third thing, which is all cells come from pre existing cells, that means there has to be DNA that's connected to that. And also, energy flow occurs within a cell because a cell needs energy in order for it to function and do all the things. The last thing I want to bring attention to is the characteristics of life. So we know the cell theory and what has to be true of anything with cells, but this has to be true of anything that is living. And this is going to be key for us figuring out if viruses are living or not. If you're living, there has to be organization within your cell. The next thing, homeostasis. That cell has to be able to maintain balance or stability within itself. Anything that's living grows and develops. Anything that's living reproduces, it adapts, it evolves on its own. It gets better to increase its chance of survival. If you're living, you have to consist of at least one cell. You have to use energy in order to be able to do all the things like growing and reproducing. And then the last thing is if something is living, it is responding to its environment. Okay, so it responds like just like if we touch a hot stove, we're like, ooh, we move. We are living, and that's what we do, and that's what all living things do. Now, here's my question for you. And I really want you to think about this and write this down. Do you think that viruses are living or not living based on what we know about the characteristics of life and the cell theory? Go ahead and take like 30 seconds and write your answer down. Okay, so we're going to see later if you're right. So now we're going to get to my favorite part of the lesson, which is distinguishing the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So prokaryotes, I like to think of this thing I teach my students, which is pro means no. Okay. And what do I mean by no? This is no nucleus and no membrane because it stands for membrane bound organelles. So prokaryotes have no nucleus and no membrane bound organelles. And then eukaryotic cells, U is true, or you can say U is do, right? So it does have a nucleus and it has or membrane bound organelles. Now, let's go ahead and continue to distinguish. So here, this right here is a picture of a prokaryotic cell example. So this is a bacteria. And as we can see, prokaryotes have structures inside of them. They're just not blank little capsules. No, they have structures inside of them. And so we know that prokaryotes do not have a nucleus and they do not have membrane bound organelles. But we see these other structures. So what do prokaryotes have? Prokaryotes have circular DNA, and we can see an example of that right here. Now, this differs from eukaryotes in that eukaryotes have linear DNA. So it's usually organized in these structures called chromosomes, which you're going to learn about in later units. The next thing is that prokaryotes have cell membrane, cytoplasm, and ribosomes. What is that? So the cell membrane is this structure right here, and it's also called a plasma membrane. So it's this outline inside of the cell that basically help with transporting materials inside and out of the cell. It just also serves as an extra barrier. Then you have the cytoplasm, which is this jelly-like substance that's kind of like have fruit inside of jello and it just kind of like sits in there and it's movable, but it helps to bring some sort of structure. That is what cytoplasm is. And then ribosomes are these little tiny dot structures that you see, and ribosomes help to create proteins. And proteins have many functions inside of our cells, which we learned when we talked about biomolecules. And the last thing we want to name is that prokaryotic cells are small inside. Now, how does that compare to eukaryotes? Well, guess what? These three things that prokaryotes have, eukaryotes have the same thing. They have cell membranes here, they have cytoplasm, and they also have ribosomes. So that is something that's similar between them. Three things that are similar. So we definitely want to keep that top of mind. And the last kind of difference is that eukaryotes are large in size compared to prokaryotes. So in this graphic right here, we see similarities and differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and we definitely want to keep those top of mind. So now I want you to take what you have learned in that last slide and apply it here. Fill out the Venn diagram, and you're going to identify characteristics that only prokaryotes have, only eukaryotes have, and characteristics that both of them have. Go ahead and take 2 minutes, pause the video, and then unpause it when you're ready to see if you were correct. Go ahead and begin. So what is true for only prokaryotic cells? They have no membrane-bound organelles. They have no nucleus. An example is a bacteria. The prokaryotic cells have circular DNA and they're small in size. Eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles. They have a nucleus. And examples, which I didn't touch on this last slide, but examples are plant and animal cells. They have linear DNA and they're larger in size. So what do they have in common then? They both have DNA. If you didn't get that down, write it down. Remember that first slide when we talked about the cell theory and things that have to be true. If it is a cell, it has to have genetic material. And that means prokaryotes and eukaryotes are cells, which means they have to have DNA inside of them. The next thing is they both have cytoplasm, they both have a cell membrane, and they both have ribosomes. Now that we know what cells have, let's distinguish that from viruses. So viruses come in various shapes and sizes. We see an example here, and we see the circular example here. So they definitely can look different, which is kind of cool when you begin to study them. But let's go deeper into what they have and if those components inside of viruses are similar to that of cells. Because if there is a lot of similarity and they meet the characteristics of life, then they're living. But if they don't, that means they're not living. So the first thing is viruses have no nucleus. They have no membrane-bound organelles. They also have DNA or RNA. So right now you're probably like, whoa, these sound a lot like prokaryotes. They might be living because prokaryotes have all three of these. But here's where it begins to differ. Viruses require a host cell to replicate. And also, viruses are smaller than both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Viruses are not living. They are not prokaryotic cells and they are not eukaryotic cells, even though they have DNA. Even though there's no nucleus, just like a prokaryote, and there's no membrane-bound organelles, they are not cells at all because they need a host to replicate. And we have to remember our characteristics of life. One of the things that's required is that they need to be able to reproduce on their own, and they can't reproduce without having a host. It's kind of like any kind of alien show. It's like in order for the alien to live, they have to like connect to the host and live within their body. Well, if you have to do that, that means you cannot live on your own. And if you can't live and function on your own, that means you are not a living thing. So now I want you to answer this question. There are many differences between prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and viruses. However, there is one commonality between all of them. I want you to take 1 minute, look through your notes, and I want you to write down your answer. And then we're going to see at the end if you got it right. Go ahead and take 1 minute. The answer is they all have genetic material, whether that is DNA or RNA, which is the one thing that they all have in common.